Jeff is taking a huge risk today. He's had nightmares and all. Thinking about what the next FOA might look like and using his, is it working? It's not working. And using his experience. Megan, can you check the clicker? It doesn't seem to be clicking. Using his experience from writing several applications and being a part of the Domestic Policy Council, Jeff is now the president of the Policy Equity Group, LLC, a consultancy that empowers socially conscious organizations by providing advocacy, research, and communication support. He's a nationally known advocate and researcher with both private and public experience. And prior to founding his consultancy, he was a senior policy advisor for early childhood development education at the Administration for Children and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Mr. Capizzano served as Vice President of Research and Public Policy and Teaching Strategies, developer of a widely used early childhood curriculum and assessment system. I got to know Jeff really well working on the last Early Learning Challenge Race to the Top application, and I can say both at home and in his work, he's really committed to helping all of us get this work done. So let's be supportive of him, ask questions, but he's not going to have all the answers, but he's going to give you a real good look into what the FOA might be. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. Yay. Good afternoon, everybody. We had this planned out perfectly, right? The FOA was going to come out in early April, and I was going to parse it for you, and I was going to use my experience working on Head Start competitions in Detroit and Sunflower County, Mississippi, and across the country to sort of, give you some lessons learned. There was only sort of one small problem that, the FOA decided not to come out. So, and I did actually literally have nightmares about this, and so you guys have to help me with this. So the nightmare was that as I was presenting, the FOA came out, right? That might happen, right? So if that does happen, can just somebody raise your hand and let me know so I can sit down and we can all read it together, right? So, but anyway, but in my defense, I think, the way that I've been approaching the application process with the different applicants that I've been coaching is that this is actually an assessment, right? It's an assessment of how well the applicant can implement early Head Start program performance standards in child care centers and in family child care homes. And that's not going to change about this. The structure might change, but all of the different applications that have come out in the past measure that, and I think that's going to be the same with this. So instead of sort of thinking about this session as the nuts and bolts of the application, it's renamed now, what will the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships Funding Opportunity Announcement look like? So key criteria from past Early Head Start applications. So, sure, sorry guys. All right, let me move this up a little bit. Can you guys hear me better now? Okay, sorry about that. All right, so here's what I want to do. The true benefit of this meeting is you talking to each other. And I think what I want to do as for one of the goals of this is, is this better? Okay. Is that I want to provide a little bit of context regarding these conversations. So I don't want you, as you talk about sort of how you might build systems around this, how you might apply for this, that you don't talk past what it's going to be in the application criteria. Then I want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the different roles that the states can play as applicant, as sort of a leader of local applicants. And then I'll walk through the criteria of past applications and share some lessons learned from earlier rounds of the competition, and then talk for a few minutes about a TA document that I developed for the meeting that's going to be revised actually when the FOA did come out. And I think obviously we need to talk about caveats to this presentation, right? So this is really a discussion of the application criteria that's based on past Early Head Start funding opportunity announcements. It shouldn't be used as a template, obviously, to guide your proposals if you're going to write one. If you do that, you will lose because the criteria is going to change. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think this is designed really to help you in your conversations moving forward. Okay, so I wanted to start with what I think is a common point of reference for people in the room. So how many people here worked on their state Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge applications? Okay, so yes. I was sweating and shaking as I was making the slide. So I know exactly how you feel. But if you think about sort of how that application was structured, it was designed very specifically, from a systems building perspective, right? You started off with Section A, where you were talking about, here's the foundation, here's the current system I have in my state, here is the, enormous commitment that the state has to early childhood through funding and the policies and the legislation. And then what you did with that foundation is you started to build the application off of that foundation. You had to start in Section B with your TQRIS and how that was going to be revised. And then you had the opportunity to make some choices. In Section C, D, and E, you could talk about your early learning standards, comprehensive assessment, health, behavioral, and developmental needs of your children and how to build up that part of your system. You could talk about family engagement. And what you were trying to do in those parts of the application is make choices about what was not only going to score you the most points, but also, where are the key areas that really need to be improved in my state, and where can we get the most bang for the buck with the Race to the Top money. And then you get to talk about different sections of the aspects of your workforce and your workforce development policies, and then you ended with a discussion of KEA or your data system. So that's sort of the way that the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge was structured. And if you look at sort of the past FOAs out of Early Head Start, it looks much different because it's not about systems building as much. It's about program implementation and building a system sort of on the ground. And I actually really like the structure of the Early Head Start applications more than I do the Race to the Top because it builds so nicely on itself as you go forward. So Joan talked a little bit about, you need to start with the facts, right, and build the vision from the facts. That's exactly what the past Early Head Start FOAs do. They say, okay, what is the geographic area you want to serve, and why do you want to serve that area? And tell me a little bit about the needs of the specific needs of the children in that area. So if you're in Onslow County, North Carolina, you're a military community, you're talking about the specific needs of the poor children of military families. If you're in San Francisco, you're talking about the tremendous diversity of the children and all the different languages that are spoken there. If you're in Sunflower County, Mississippi, you're talking about rural poverty. If you're in Detroit, you're talking about urban poverty and crime. And so it's really about, we talked about individualizing these proposals. This is where that individualization starts. It starts with your understanding the needs of your community and really talking about that. What happens in Section 2 then is you start to build your program model based very specifically on the needs that are articulated in the first section. And you talk about your curriculum, your program model, all the different services you're going to bring to bear on those needs. Then you talk about, as an applicant, how have I done this in the past? What sort of past performance indicators can I give the reviewers to say that I'm really good at implementing this model already and I can do it? And then, given my past experience, what things am I going to have to change in the staffing and workforce support section to implement this new model? And then, what's my organizational capacity to do it, and then how I'm going to pay for it. So you can draw a pretty straight line through the application with every section building on the section before it, a little different than Race to the Top. And so one of the things that's really important is that there are so many commonalities between what you do in an Early Head Start proposal and what you did in Race to the Top. And I think when you think about sort of a state level system that you're building in Race to the Top, you're building a microsystem through the Head Start grant at the local level. So you have infant and toddler standards and guidelines that you might have talked about in your Race to the Top. Head Start has early learning standards too, and they have school readiness goals that need to be aligned with the Head Start standards, with the state early learning standards. You have workforce development initiatives at the state level. You have to talk about your leadership and your staffing and your professional development plan and your career opportunities for your staffing for Early Head Start. So lots of alignment. You talk about family engagement activities in the state level. I worked with Maryland on the Maryland Family Engagement Framework. You have to meet the goals of the Parent Family Community Engagement Framework and Head Start. So lots of alignment. Talk about comprehensive assessment systems in your race to the top. You have to talk about screening, child assessment and referrals, and then regular observations of teacher-child interaction. So there's a lot of connection between what you're building at the state level and what you're trying to implement on the ground. Same with the health development, behavioral and developmental needs, and Yvette talked a little bit about that. So one of the things that I always do with the applicants is we talk about the weighting of the different sections of the application, because it gives you a really clear indication of the priorities of whoever's issuing the RFP. So if you look at the way that those different sections of the application are scored or weighted, you see something very telling, right? So the key section of the application is the program design. And we're in a post Head Start impact study world where we had a study that didn't show the impacts that we would have hoped in Head Start, and you can debate the methodologies and everything else. But what this tries to do is we want to focus on the point of impact with children. And so that's why the program design piece is so heavily weighted. That's where you talk about your curriculum, your assessment, and all the different pieces. And all the other sections are important, but it's really weighted very heavily to that program design. The other piece that's fundamentally different from Race to the Top, and this is, when we were writing our Race to the Top applications, they had suggested page limits, right? And so, we blew through those page limits and we never looked back, right? I actually wanted to give some examples, so I went to the Race to the Top page, and it was taking so long to download the appendices that I had trouble. But I got Michigan's down. They had a 324-page narrative and a 968-page appendix. Very nice. Georgia had, So Georgia had a 587-page narrative. I don't know if Georgia's here, and a 1,815-page appendix. Yeah. New Jersey had a 293-page narrative, and I actually couldn't get the appendix to download for me. So I'm guessing maybe 10,000, 12,000 pages. I don't know. So this is very different. So these are hard page limits for, and these may actually change. And one of the things that Joan warned me about, one of the things I should be doing before every sentence is saying the word historically. So historically, these have been the page limits. Historically, those have been the sections. So we don't know whether or not that's actually going to be the case, but it'll be something, hopefully something like this. But you have a one-page abstract, and then you have 100 pages to write your narrative. And that's where you're writing about the community needs, you're writing about your program design, you're writing about your staffing and your organizational capacity. So it's not a ton of room to do that. My colleague that I worked with a lot on the coaching is like, that's some prime real estate there. You really got to know how to use it. So, and that is true. Then you have to do your budget justification is about 10 pages, and then you have this other phase 2 piece that we won't talk too much about now, but you have to prove that you have strong internal controls as an applicant, and that you can actually implement from a financial and ethical and internal controls perspective. And so you write about that there. And then you only get 100 pages of appendices. I don't know what Michigan and New Jersey and those guys are going to do, but no, I'm kidding. So you need to be very strategic about how you go about doing this. And sort of that led me in working with different applicants. It sort of led to this discussion between small and large applicants and what the benefits are, because if you only have a certain number of pages, you have to do different things as a large applicant with those pages than you do if you're small. And one of the things about big applicants, when I work with those that are either do something statewide or do something citywide in a community, there are a lot of arguments for why being big is good. Right. So one of the big arguments that's used is that you can see the whole field. Like if you're a program, you're kind of constrained by your catchment area and where your program is. But if you're big, you can really choose what parts of the state or what parts of the community you think need those slots the most. Also, you can create economies of scale if you're a large applicant, and so if you look at any sort of curriculum publisher's, website and you look at the costs of child assessment, if you're going to get, 50 licenses for online child assessment, that's going to cost you $20 a child. If you're going to get 5,000 of those, it's going to cost you $9.99. So you can be more efficient in your budgeting if you're doing something big, and I'm hoping like some of the shared services conversations that happen, throughout the course, you can still get that scale even if you're small, and that's something we can talk about in the individual conversations. Also, if you're big, you tend to have stronger networks and you know more people, and you can sort of tap into those networks, and you have access to other sources of funding. So those are some of the, some of the arguments you make if you're a big applicant. But if you're a small applicant, you make sort of different arguments about sort of why you should be the grantee. You're closer to the ground, you know your community better than anybody else, you know your providers, you know your children. You can spend a lot more time with those 100 pages talking very specifically about your model, where if you're a statewide or a community-wide applicant and you have like 50 different partners, you don't have as much time to talk about what each of the partners might do with the children in their communities. And then you're more hands-on, you can more closely monitor what's going on. So hopefully as we talk about sort of what we want to do in states, you can take both of those and sort of make have sort of the big, the big where it's important and the small where it counts. And so we can talk more about that. Okay, and as you know, there's a number of different ways states can be involved in the application process, right? The first, obviously, is as the applicant. So if a state wants to apply, you can be you can act as the grantee, the fiscal sponsor of the grant, and then you're selecting the geographic locations for it, you're selecting the partners, and you're in charge of all of the program model components like curriculum assessment and the other services that meet the Head Start program performance standards. You can also act as a leader and supportive partner, where if you don't want to be the applicant, you can support the local applicants by providing resources and by bringing state resources to bear on the applications. And one of the things I do in the TA document is I talk a little bit about, if you're going to do an MOU with a local applicant, sort of what are some of the things that you might want to promise, and what are some of the things that an applicant might want to promise you if you're going to work together. And then, you can also just be an interested observer. And I've talked to a couple of different states that are actually going to be taking this role. And essentially, it's like, if I ask my staff to take on anything else, they are going to leave me, right? And it's just it is the reality. And so what they want to do is they want to focus on their current obligations, either with their Race to the Top grant or whatever other initiatives that they're working on, and they'll be supportive of the eventual winner, but they just want to sort of watch this as it moves forward. Am I pointing in the wrong direction, maybe? Next. Anyway, so the next slide's a real killer too. No, I'm kidding. So one of the other things that I want to talk about is like this Head Start is is traditionally a federal to local program, right? So there can be local applicants within a state that just apply, right? And they don't sort of connect with the state, but there are certain things. Yeah, there you go. So there are certain sort of levers of influence that states have that can sort of entice local applicants to be sort of a part of, or at least include the state in what's going on. So, the state obviously is the keeper of data. They have lots of information about the quality of childcare programs and sort of the number of subsidy slots that are in different childcare providers. And I think, part of what's important about the partners is it's the way that I think about it is that you need to find sort of the sweet spot in sort of the provider quality. You don't necessarily want to work with a provider that won't have the opportunity to meet the Head Start program performance standards, and so you have to find those providers that actually have the potential to do it. So and that's one of the you can do that through your QRIS data. You're also the administrator of a number of different social service programs, that can be used in the Head Start programs. You have all of these other workforce development initiatives. You have quality improvement initiatives. You have professional development initiatives going on in the state that can be used, by potential applicants that they can tap into. You have all of these pre-existing collaborative relationships like the state advisory councils that can be tapped into, and you have relationships with other institutions, philanthropy and higher ed, that can also be used sort of to make applications stronger. And I think when you're an applicant thinking about this, you want to try to figure out what your competitive advantage is. How do you make your application as strong as possible? And having these sorts of connections to the state will make the application stronger. Okay, I want to talk just a little bit of some specific aspects of the application. The first section, as I talked about, was the demonstration of need. And one of the things that I try to do with the grantees or the applicants that I work with is that you want to start with your top level message. So, one of the things that happens a lot with grant applications is you just start writing to the criteria and you lose the story. And you want to really always have the vision and the story in mind as you're writing. So what we do is so for this demonstration of need for services, what story are you wanting to tell? And the story is, I know the needs of my service area. I'm actively engaged in promoting the well-being of children and families in that area, and my program option and my partners were chosen to best meet those needs. So that is your top-level story for that section, and then you go through and you talk about, okay, here are the locations of greatest need, here's my rationale for my choice of partners, here's my presence in the community and my plan to meet the needs, and here's how I'm going to go about either increasing the number of early Head Start kids in the community or improving the quality of or improving the quality for eligible children in that community. So that's that section. And so, what we did in Detroit is, programs they're not demographers. Like early childhood programs, they don't do demography. So one of the things that we did in Detroit was we had Data-Driven Detroit take the different data points from the Head Start, the Birth to 5 pilots, and they actually went and got the data for us. And so here's just kind of an example of what that looked like. I think when you're doing that section, the very sort of at the very foundation of what the reviewer is looking for is, if they put Head Start programs in that area, will they have enough eligible children to fulfill enrollment? And what they did, and if you can see the darkest blue places on this map are those places that have, over 100 early children birth to 3 in poverty. So the different parts of the community, and unfortunately it's most of the community where they have high poverty levels. So and then the next section, the achieving the learning and development outcomes to promote school readiness for children, sort of the top line story is about, my program's model employs the field's best practices to promote child outcomes. And this is where you would talk about your curriculum, the assessment that you're going to use, how you develop school readiness goals for the children in your program, how you support the special needs of children with disabilities, dual language, children who are homeless, what sort of screening and referral process you're going to use, family engagement, how you're going to coordinate with other programs, and then how are you going to facilitate effective transitions, either from pregnancy, birth into the program, and then from early Head Start into a Head Start program or some other child care program. So in the past performance section, sort of the top line story there is, my organization's history and experience support our ability to implement the comprehensive child development program proposed in the application. So here you're showing that your performance sort of warrants your winning of the grant. And what you do here is you talk about the evidence of improvement. Either you've worked with programs that have improved in their TQRIS ratings. If you have class scores or other teacher-child interaction measures, those have improved. You demonstrate your staff development system and your professional experience and of your management team, and how what you're proposing now with the Early Head Start grant is different from what you've done in the past, and how you're going to sort of make that work. The next is around staffing and supporting strong early learning workforce. Here, you're going to talk about the proposed staff will be able to form strong relationships with children and families and be able to implement each evidence-based program component. And here you talk about your staff qualifications, how you maintain staff-child ratios, what kind of career opportunities you're giving for parents and other members of the community, how you're going to evaluate job applicants that come in, and then the professional development strategy. So this is sort of a little bit in the weeds, but this is sort of what the application is most likely going to ask for. And then you talk about the organizational capacity and governance, that you have the capacity to effectively implement the model, you oversee operations and comply with federal, state, and local laws and regulations. And then you move into the budget. And so this is always kind of an interesting one where, you know, the cost of the budget has to be reasonable in relation to what you're putting in the narrative. I think, you know, we found this with Race to the Top, and I found it with a lot of applicants where they get to the end of all the things they want to do, they cost it out, and you've completely blown away your budget. And so you're backtracking. And so you know, I have a lessons learned slide on that, actually. So, okay. And so in terms of sort of what we've learned from past competitions, I think, you know, one of the interesting exercises we did in Detroit was around, you know, what is the, what's the story you want the administration to tell about your proposal, you know, after the competition is over? What do you want them to write about you in their press release? And this sort of goes to the vision piece. And I think, you know, when we talked about this in Detroit, you know, one of the applicants was like, well, you know, we know that the administration is really interested in pre-K, and we also, you know, that we're getting a lot more flexibility with this birth to 5 model. What if we proposed a birth to 4 model, and then with a strong transition into the state's pre-K program? And, you know, that was ultimately what they built their entire application around, and it was successful. I think, you know, one of the other big pieces is that, you know, outcomes are a product of quality, intensity, and fidelity. So those 3 pieces have to come through. You can't just have a high-quality program. If you have a high-quality program that isn't of enough intensity, then you're not going to get the outcomes. And if you have a high-quality program that's proposed that you can't achieve fidelity, that won't work either. I think the other piece is that, you know, you want to grab all the points you can, but you need to have a narrative that goes along with it and has to run through the proposal. And then this is my favorite one, and it's amazing that I have to talk about it, but you need to try to avoid automatic disqualification factors. So, yeah. And unfortunately, like, if you submit it too late, and you know, you wait to the last minute and grants.gov doesn't have enough time to process it, and you don't have the validation stamp. You know, Joan and I were talking about a fairly prominent applicant during ARA that did that, and there's nothing we can do about it. I think, you know, exceeding the budget is also an automatic disqualification factor, and you don't want to do that. And then there is a really nice document that's it's registration and preparation for grant submission. And I would suggest that all of you look at that if you're interested in applying or getting your applicants to do that. And then I think, you know, one of the things we learned is that your narrative team, whoever's doing all of the sort of substantive aspects, and your CFO or whoever's doing sort of the budget pieces, they have to work side by side throughout the entire process, so you can avoid having sort of a scenario where you're way over proposing during the sort of the development process. And then you need to have a clear strategy to win throughout, and it has to be based on your strengths, and you don't want to try to be something that you're not, because the application is such a straight line that if you try to be, if you're big and you try to be small, it's going to come out during the application, and so you want to sort of be true to your strengths and work off of that. Okay, just a minute about sort of the TA document that we're putting together. I think, you know, there are a number of different roles that the state can play, as I talked about, and so what I've done is I've said, okay, here's the criteria we think is going to be in the application. Here's what the applicants must do, and if you're a state, that is what you're going to do. And if you don't want to apply, here are all the different ways that you could be supporting on that specific aspect of the criteria. So for geographic location, for example, you know, the applicant has to do all the stuff around a data-driven rationale of why they're choosing that particular place to put the slots. And then what the state can do to support that is if you have state longitudinal data, you can use that to help build that case. And that is actually, that's in your packet. It's right here. And I think that's it. So if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you. Are you guys going to do mics? Yeah.
Sorry, can't get there fast enough.
I'm wondering about, this is Billy Young with NEYC, and I am wondering about, particularly around professional development and staff qualifications workforce, that there might be some challenges with the child care partners being able to meet the staff qualifications, although Early Head Start CDA is more achievable than the BA for older kids.
Right.
But still, it seems like some systemic approaches would be very helpful in helping child care providers meet that, and I'm wondering how Head Start funding could contribute towards systemic approaches in a state, like statewide CDA training that everybody could benefit from, and that would be much more cost-effective if it were done in a systemic way. Things like having articulation agreements so that we can help staff who have lots of credits but they're not adding up to degrees. Mm-hmm. How could we use this opportunity to get funding for systemic professional development approaches that would really benefit all the participants?
I think this is a good question. One of the sort of the issues with the Head Start funding, and I should probably defer to my Head Start colleagues on this, but it seems like the cost allocation for Head Start is that Head Start funding has to be spent on Head Start children for Head Start services, right, Yvette? So one of the things the way that I would approach this potentially is that, just in the same way that you try to use Race to the Top and this funding opportunity to make changes in state level policy because you had this opportunity, you would do the same thing with this Head Start money. So even though you might not be able to use the Head Start money to leverage sort of a statewide CDA program, you could use this as, here's an opportunity that we have in the state, and here's more money that we can bring down, and here's the best way to use it would be through these new state level initiatives, I think. You want? Yeah. I need you.
I guess the one thing I would add is that every early Head Start program gets training and technical assistance money. So this would be more of a lift, but one thing to think about would be is that how you would get your early Head Start partners to agree to use a portion of their funds for the system. And we see some of these examples are small, but we've seen in some places where early Head Start and Head Start programs come together with a state or a child care partner and say, okay, I'm willing to use a portion of my TA money to help with this piece because I can show that it benefits my program and my kids too.
I bet you should keep the mic.
Yeah, so you build it into your TA budget.
If a state does decide to apply, does that in any way negatively impact local communities or local programs from also applying because they're splitting the pot in some way?
Yeah, anyone who can apply. I think what's interesting is that you could have a scenario in which the state is competing against local applicants in that state. I think one of the things that was interesting about some of the competition in New York City, for example, is you had the citywide entity was an applicant, and a lot of smaller entities within the city were also applying. And so the way that the Office of Head Start ended up doing it was that they ranked the scores. And so if there was $100 million that was available for New York, I think it was more than that, and there were 3 or 4 applicants that proposed to spend $40 million, and they scored higher than the big applicant, that they would get that $40 million, and then the big applicant would get the $60 million that was left. And so that's how it worked. And so there is an opportunity for local entities to apply independent of the state and the state compete against them, and if the state comes in second, then they would get whatever they proposed minus what whoever beat them had proposed. Does that make sense? Historically that has been, and yeah, exactly.
Have you heard yet whether or not the funding's going to be allocated to the states, or is it going to be based on everyone's scores and then who the top scores are? Because it's done both ways.
We do not know.
Have you? When they read the grants and they rank them, sometimes they say each state has an allocation and you've got so much money based on your poverty numbers in your state. But sometimes they don't fund them that way, and it's funded from the top down, who has the best scores. And do you know if it's going to be based on allocations per state?
So traditionally, when we do national competitions like we did, so think about ARA. ARA was a national competition. You do state allocations, and that's based normally on the base funding that a state received in the previous year. For the partnerships, the law specifically states that it's based on the poverty census data. So it'll be state allocations, but that's what national competitions are. Some states will get less. I mean, depends on your population and the number of children you have living in poverty under 5. That's how the allocation will be split up.
Just 2 more questions, says Sherry. Okay. All right. How's that? Great. Thank you, guys.